Lee Kuan Yew, born 16 September 1923, passed away 23 March 2015. Often referred to by his initials LKY, was a Singaporean lawyer, politician, and statesman who served as the founding Prime Minister of Singapore between 1959 and 1990. He was one of the greatest leaders of the 20th and 21st centuries. Hear what other world leaders say of him in Section 1. He had also his views on other great leaders. Hear what he said of world leaders in Section 2. Section 1.
The Minister Mentor of Singapore. This is one of the legendary figures of Asia in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Well, I think Lee Kuan Yew was a great man.
I'm delighted to welcome the Minister Mentor here today. It is fair to say, sir, that you have a great many admirers. You're here to accept an important award.
If you like this video, please subscribe.
Well, I think Lee Kuan Yew was a great man. I had the great fortune of becoming a personal friend, and we saw each other many, many times. He stayed at my house, and I've often visited Singapore. There was never a month when we weren't talking to each other. So I will miss him, but more important, the world will miss him. Lee Kuan Yew was a very meticulous person. So when you were invited, before I came to Singapore, he'd send me the menu of the meals that he was going to offer me and give me a chance to comment that if I didn't like it, that I could change. And that's never happened to me. That's never happened to me anywhere. But I think what he said, what he seemed to be is what he was. He was committed to Singapore, and he was committed to an international world in which small countries could survive. And he went around the world preaching this and succeeding.
Hello, everybody. I just want to welcome the Minister Mentor of Singapore. This is one of the legendary figures of Asia in the 20th and 21st centuries. He is somebody who helped to trigger the Asian economic miracle. Singapore has been an outstanding friend and ally of the United States for many, many years. And so I am very much looking forward to the opportunity to hearing from the Minister Mentor his views on the evolving situation in Asia as I prepare for my upcoming trip both to Singapore and to other key nations in the region. And so I'm very grateful that he took the time. Welcome. And on behalf of the American people, we want to say thank you to the people of Singapore for being such outstanding friends.
Thank you, Mr. President, for those very warm words.
Tomorrow, Singapore will hold a state funeral for Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Mr. Lee was a strategist and statesman respected across the world for his outstanding contribution to the peace and development of Asia and the exchanges and cooperation between Asia and the world. I want to take this opportunity to pay high tribute to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and all those who have made contribution to Asia's peace and development.
His work as Prime Minister and now as Minister Mentor have helped literally millions of people from Singapore and all across Southeast Asia to live better, more prosperous lives.
All of us who work with him have benefited from his wisdom, his insight, and dedication.
He has become a seminal figure for all of us. As I said, I've known him for 40 years. I would say I've not learned as much from anybody as I have from Lee Kuan Yew.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome the Minister Mentor here today. He is no stranger to our country. Singapore is a long and valued partner on so many important issues. And I think it is fair to say, sir, that you have a great many admirers. You're here to accept an important award that is given for lifetime achievement. And I join in the many Americans who thank you for your service.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I've come at a very important moment in America. It's a time for renewal and resumption of the engagement of America, in particular with Southeast Asia and East Asia. It is the part of the world that will alter the shape of the 21st century.
So we have our work cut out for us, sir. Thank you. Where did you arrive?
He's a one-man world intelligence agency.
A man of total rectitude, high intelligence, and one of the great leaders that I have met.
He is an outstanding character, very difficult to put into a prefabricated category. He is somebody singular.
He's one of the leaders I admire most in the world. He was one of the finest leaders of the 20th century.
How are you, Mr. President? Happy to meet you. Good to see you again. You look splendid.
Prime Minister Lee and Mrs. Lee, honored guests who are here tonight, Nancy and I welcome you to the White House. It was a great pleasure for me today to renew a valued friendship with Prime Minister Lee. I first met the Prime Minister on a trip that I took on behest of President Nixon. And when we stopped in Singapore, I was amazed at the dynamic society that I found there. How could a country with such a small area and few resources be making such strides? And then I met Prime Minister Lee, and my questions were answered. He is a man of principle and vision. His leadership has provided the vigorous and creative people of Singapore the means to move ahead, to achieve, and to build. Singapore's experience has been in stark contrast to developing countries where political power has been derived from terror and brute force. Instead, Prime Minister Lee's authority has rested on his capacity to mold the opinion of his countrymen and build consensus. He has used his position to free the talents and energy of his people so they could be channeled into constructive society-building activity. Fortunately, Prime Minister Lee's sound judgment does not stop at the water's edge. American leaders, including this one, have frequently benefited from his wise counsel. Our meetings today were no less beneficial. Our exchange was cordial, reflecting a mutuality of interests and a harmony of views. Mr. Prime Minister, I want to express my personal admiration for your recognition of the contributions America makes to world peace. As the world's most powerful democracy, our people carry a heavy military and diplomatic burden, an often thankless task. But you have demonstrated an appreciation and understanding that makes it all worthwhile. This spirit of mutual respect was evidenced in our meetings today. None of this should be reason for surprise. Our two peoples may at first glance seem worlds apart, both in geographic location and culture. But a closer look reveals that Singapore and the United States are nations made up of hard-working immigrants and their descendants who came to a new homeland to improve their lot and build a decent life for their families. We're both democratic nations, committed to peace and to the preservation of human liberty. And these bonds are being bolstered by continued cultural and educational exchanges and, of course, the many commercial ties between our peoples.
Section 2.
Leadership varies with time and circumstance. And the subject I know best is what constitutes political leadership. If you read the present media, you say that the world is bereft of great leaders. There was no Winston Churchill or Roosevelt or Stalin or Charles de Gaulle. In my lifetime, they were great men. I lived my most impressionable years when they made massive decisions that decided the shape of the post-war world. What did they have in common? An ability to communicate. Most of all, Winston Churchill. I heard him on radio when Britain was looking as if it was going to be captured. And I heard him, and it was a rousing, indomitable, defiant speech that galvanized the people, bought the British time, I think inspired his RAF pilots, and so they won the Battle of Britain, bought time. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, America came into the war, and the rest was history. The one who I would admire most after Churchill in my lifetime would be Charles de Gaulle. I don't know French, but I read of him. And he saved the honor, the amour-propre of France, because it was a captured, defeated country. But as France went down, he left, went to London, adopted by Winston Churchill, and he broadcasted. But he was never Churchill's protege. He was the most irascible, difficult, uncontrollable leader of the Free French forces. But he was a leader. Years later, I read his biography, not in French, but in English, a translation. And I was fascinated. Here was a man whose country has been captured, was able to wear his uniform and try and form the Free French forces with whatever remnants of French troops or airmen or sailors who escaped. And when the Americans landed in North Africa, and they were in Algiers, Algiers was then part of Vichy France and was captured. He went up to the French general in charge, and guarding the French general were American troops. He went in and says, he berated the man and says, "You are a general of France. Why do you have American troops guarding you?" His impudence, without the American troops, he was a puppet of the Germans. But he had that courage, that spirit. And he went back to France, and the Americans and the British decided it would be good for France and for them that the Free French forces would liberate Paris. They having sacrificed the majority of their forces at Normandy. And he gave the French people an alibi. So whenever they are accused of having collaborated with the Germans, he was evidence of the spirit of resistance. That's a very great man. And when France collapsed in a series of revolving door governments. He came back in 1957. Got himself properly elected by the legislature, adopted as the president, changed the constitution, and governed France, and restored what he called was grandeur.
Lee Kuan Yew on Xi Jinping. I met Xi Jinping for the first time in November 2007. He struck me as a man of great breadth. He has gravitas. Consider further the trials and tribulations that he has been through, having been rusticated as a young man, sent to Shaanxi province in 1969, but working his way slowly back up, never complaining, never grumbling. I would put him in the Nelson Mandela class of persons.
I'm familiar with most of the first generation of anti-colonial leaders to which I belong. They all had strong nationalist, anti-colonial convictions and wanted to prove that their people or their peoples could measure up to their former rulers. But they admired the early independence heroes, Nehru, Sukarno, Mao Zedong, Tito. None of these early freedom fighters believed that wealth was something that had to be created by entrepreneurs, people who raised capital, organized workers to produce goods and services that others wanted and would pay for because their prices were competitive. They all believed that there were shortcuts to prosperity, and they thought the best way was by state intervention. This was a mistake that otherwise well-intentioned leaders like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania made. He was a good, honest Christian, but held doctrinaire ideas on how to modernize Tanzania. His policies were ill-suited for a small-scale African agricultural economy. And both Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia failed to develop their economies. On the other hand, Jomo Kenyatta and his successor, Daniel Arap Moi of Kenya, made their country more prosperous in spite of considerable corruption. What was the difference? It lay in the interventionist state policies of the first two compared to the free market policies of Kenya.
Lee Kuan Yew on Margaret Thatcher is the one with trousers on the front bench. Admiredly, Lee Kuan Yew referred to Margaret Thatcher as a conviction politician.
I would always gladly come here to see the work you are doing, to see the success you are creating, and always to have a talk with the Prime Minister of Singapore, who shares my beliefs.
Deng Xiaoping is a great man. He fought a great revolution. He saw the product of that revolution turn sour. He was fortunate to live long enough, and he had the courage to say, no, we change course. Let's learn. Let's stop trying to do everything by ourselves. So they started importing and buying Boeing 707s. So they bought Tridents instead of trying to manufacture their own aircraft. Eventually they will, but it will take 2, maybe 3 generations.
If you look at China, without Mao Zedong, maybe China would not have been so easily liberated, as they call it. But had he continued, I think China would have been in a parlous condition. So fortunately for China, the man he rusticated, Deng Xiaoping, came back from the wilderness, pushed aside Hua Guofeng. In 1978, he visited Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and Singapore to persuade us to combine with China and stop Vietnam, the Cuba in Southeast Asia of the Soviet Union. when they were about to attack Cambodia. I had the privilege of meeting him, talking to him for 3 days. And he is, in my lifetime, the most impressive man I have ever met. Small, barely 5 feet, stood erect, tremendous aplomb, a man of few words, but carefully thought, every few words carefully thought out.
In my last visit in September, Prime Minister Putin saw me and said, "We are building a university in Vladivostok for the APEC summit in 2012, and after that, the premises will become a university. Will you help us fill up the university building?" I said, "We'll try."
There was no leader you admired more than the late Singapore leader, Lee Kuan Yew. Tell about the dinner that you had at your house.
Well, it was with him, and I had Paul Volcker, who Federal Reserve Chairman, and then I had Bob Rubin, who was the Treasury Secretary. And so we were around the table, and we went around and asked him who were the best leaders, who were the worst leaders, what was the complexion of the existing leaders, and so we got all of his thoughts. And very interesting man, because Singapore's this little city that is kind of a mosquito-infested swamp that had nothing particularly special other than he created a culture and a way of operating there that made Singapore what it is today. So that was what the dinner explored.
What was his reasoning for saying Vladimir Putin was one of the best leaders worldwide?
He said that you have to evaluate a leader within the context of his circumstances. And so if you go into Putin and you know the situation when he took over the Soviet Union, which was Russia at the time, because the Soviet Union had fallen apart, and there's corruption, and there's anarchy, literal anarchy, and they're broke. And Boris Yeltsin, who preceded him, was an alcoholic, and there was no government, and there was no bureaucracy. And he described how he came in, and he had to deal with all of that to create order. And he spoke about the accomplishments to stabilize it, to raise the incomes, to establish the institutions that they didn't have before, those kinds of things.